Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your patience. I know we've learned a lot today, and I thank you for choosing this particular workshop, A Blueprint on Peace and Strategies for the Violence Prevention in Milwaukee. What better subject to learn about today when we think about the violence that's going on in the city of Milwaukee and across the country? We definitely want to hear from this speaker. I've heard him before, so I know you're in for a treat. Please welcome Jamal Smith.
All right, good morning. Thank you all for being here. This is definitely an honor to be here again, speaking at this summit on poverty. As you said, my name is Jamal Smith. I am the Community Violence Prevention Manager for the City of Milwaukee Office of Violence Prevention. Before I even get started, how many of you have even heard of the Office of Violence Prevention? All right, thank you to all 5 of you. Okay, so what we're gonna do is just have a quick little overview of what the Office of Violence Prevention is, how long it's been in existence, and then talk about the Blueprint for Peace, because I think it's very necessary in today's society when we see the numbers that are increasing around violence, whether that's homicides, non-fatal shootings, aggravated assaults, simple assaults, domestic violence, child abuse, sex trafficking, all the various forms of violence that are happening. However, there's not enough discussion around the impact of systemic violence. And I think that's very vital to talk about today, especially when we're discussing poverty and understanding that there have been policies and practices and procedures and institutions that have been created that have elevated the level of poverty on certain neighborhoods, which leads to that erosion, increasing risky behaviors, which increases the opportunities for violence. Right? So that's when we talk about violence, there has to be a full conversation of what violence is, right? We can't just say that we have a problem with gun violence. We do have a problem with gun violence. We also have a problem with racism, which should be considered violence. We have a problem with sexism, with homophobia, with transphobia. All those should also be considered violence, right? So it can't just be violence, a discussion on violence, and it be conditional. It has to be a full discussion on what violence is. So the Office of Violence Prevention was created in 2008. Was under the leadership of Terry Perry, and the focus was really around domestic violence and sexual assault. That was mainly the work that the office had done. But in 2016, there was a major shift in the ways in which we address violence, right? We saw one of our worst years prior to 2020 in terms of violence. In 2014, we had 86 homicides. In 2015, we had 145. So that's a huge increase, right? And there had to be a conversation on a comprehensive plan of violence prevention, right? And it's not to say anything against law enforcement. Let's clear this now, that there's this misconception that believes that the work that the Office of Violence Prevention does is in replacement to law enforcement. That's not what we do, right? And it's to say also that there's a way to work collaboratively when it comes to violence prevention. We realize there's not one entity that can address every form of violence, right? We can't look at the police to address every major issue that we have in this country, starting even here in Milwaukee, right? We've looked to police to arrest and incarcerate poverty, substance abuse, mental health, homelessness. Those should not be forms of incarceration. That should be treatment. That should be treatment with the focus of prevention instead of using the carceral state to increase numbers around prisons, right? But we've gone to police so long for issues that do not require policing. So there was then a conversation under Mayor Baird to say, how do we really look at the comprehensive strategic plan around violence prevention? And it was the idea of saying, we're gonna address it through a public health lens. So when we talk about public health, it's really elevating the importance of ensuring that people have access to the social determinants of health. So whether that's housing, whether that's employment, healthcare, right? Transportation, food, right? Those are the social determinants of health that are necessary for communities to thrive. And when you look at the state of the city of Milwaukee, there's a reason why this city is called the worst place for African Americans in the country. As a matter of fact, Wisconsin has 2 of the 5 top cities for that. Milwaukee is 1, Racine is number 2. Right? So when you look at that, there has to be a conversation of where did we go wrong? To where at one point, because I was born and raised here, at one point, Milwaukee used to be considered one of the best cities for African Americans. Now it's considered one of the worst. Where did we go wrong? What happened? What are the root causes of violence? Racine's right behind us. Chicago is number 4. So it's in looking in that of saying, how do we have 2 of the top 5? That's a dubious distinction to have. Having 2 of the 5 worst cities in America for African Americans, according to 24/7 Wall Street. So then the conversation began, and looking at it from a public health lens, how do we start to really incorporate the community to have the discussion? Because what we've done so long is had a bureaucratic approach to violence prevention. So essentially saying, as a government, we're going to come in and tell you, people who are affected by violence on a regular basis, what we think is best for you in terms of prevention. Instead of asking the people who've been affected by violence, what do you think is best for prevention? So it took an all-encompassing, multidisciplinary effort in order to really bring about the Blueprint for Peace. And we'll get into the history of it, but this is a community-driven strategic plan that focuses on prevention from a public health lens to be able to change the landscape of where people live and the things that they experience, which then could potentially decrease and prevent violence from happening in the first place. So let's get started. Right, so the mission of the Office of Violence Prevention is to prevent and reduce violence through partnerships that strengthen youth, families, and neighborhoods, right? So again, that goes to the point that I said earlier of knowing that even though we are the Office of Violence Prevention, we are all violence prevention here. Yeah, we have an office, but it's 9 of us. 9 people can't prevent violence in a city of nearly 600,000. But the majority of the city that participates in violence prevention can prevent violence in the city. Right? That's why collaboration is needed. There's an easy answer to a complex problem, and it's always the wrong one. I want you to remember that. There's a complexity that exists in violence. It's not just black and white. There are different levels, different layers that have to be addressed when we talk about violence. And you realize that in that discussion, that it takes more than one entity to address it. So to assume that one particular office can address all various forms of violence alone is something that, again, we've depended on law enforcement to do. And that's not fair. So it has to be in collaboration. It has to be partnerships. And some of the programs that we do, we have a commission on domestic violence and sexual assault where we bring partners together to talk about ways to address domestic violence, to address sexual assault, whether that's through advocacy, organizational advocacy, grassroots advocacy, policy advocacy. We have all types of system partners, grassroots organizations that are at the table, grass tops organizations that are at the table to discuss the ways in which you address sexual assault. Recast Milwaukee is actually resilient communities after stress and trauma. So the idea there is to address what mental health has done in terms of its impact on violence, trauma reduction, mental health work, restorative justice, restorative practice work. That's all under our Recast program. But then leaving out one, 414 Life. 414 Life is our violence interruption team. I brought this sweatshirt because maybe many of you have seen this symbol around the city. Some of y'all looking like, yeah, I've seen it. Some of y'all are like, I ain't never seen that damn symbol. Okay, so this symbol is for our 414 Life team, our violence interruption team. And there's a 3-pronged approach to what our 414 Life team does. It's from the model of cure violence that we derived, ironically, from Chicago for people who think there's no work happening in Chicago. But the idea is for there to be more of a focus on conflict resolution, de-escalation of situations, which could eliminate the opportunity for retaliatory violence, in addition to street outreach and hospital respondents to service victims of families who have been impacted by gun violence. That's what our 414 Life team does. It's in partnership with Frederick Hospital and the Medical College of Wisconsin. And the idea is really having people on ground working with communities around violence, particularly gun violence. And then ultimately, the Blueprint for Peace, which we're going to discuss today as being the foundational framework around violence prevention in the city. So here's something I want you all to look at as a diagram of how the Office of Violence Prevention really looks at addressing violence in the city, right? So we look at it through addressing community, youth, family, and using the blueprint as the ideal foundation around that. So here's a conversation that, a lot of people don't really look at in terms of when we talk about violence prevention, even safe workplaces, right? Workplace violence is an issue that is not discussed enough. Unfortunately, we saw that happen last year at the shooting of Molson Coors, but a lot of that was centered around workplace violence, a culture that is violent, a culture that has been deemed to be violent. If it goes unaddressed, eventually that violence will rise, right? So that is the focus when we talk about being able to work on prevention. When we look at youth development and engagement, as well as trauma prevention and healing, what you are seeing is young people hurting. And hurt people hurt people. That's what they say, right? So you see young people that are hurting and they're lashing out because they don't feel anyone wants to address the pain they feel. So then it becomes, well, if you don't give a damn about me, why should I give a damn about you? We're seeing that play out in our streets. Right? The main question has to stop being what's wrong with you and turn into what happened. Something happened that we're not addressing. Kids do not, they are not born with violence in their minds, right? That's conditioned, that comes from somewhere. So what needed to be addressed? What was not addressed that we need to focus on? And then here's the other aspect that we need to focus on as well. The average homicide victim in the city of Milwaukee is 30. So we need to stop saying that it's youth. We don't have a youth gun violence problem. We have a gun violence problem. Bullets are age non-discriminate. So we need to figure out the ways to address all forms of violence with all forms of demographics. Okay? But the first thing that we have to do is have a conversation and talk about what violence even is, so then we can actually have a conversation around prevention. So moving into the Blueprint for Peace, this is the vision, the Blueprint for Peace. Milwaukee's a safe and resilient city where all residents are valued, promoted, and protected. So listening to the session that happened this morning and talking about the impact of racial inequities, that pretty much establishes that all residents in the city of Milwaukee are not valued, promoted, and protected. Which should be the focus, or should be the goal in terms of really building our city. We have to ensure that every resident is valued, promoted, and protected. I had a conversation with a colleague around the Foxconn deal. Opinions notwithstanding on Foxconn. But he was asking me about recruitment for engineering positions. And he was saying, Jamal, you went to an HBCU, historically Black College University, Alabama State grad here. And he said, what do you think about us having a recruitment fair for engineers from HBCUs? I said, let me get this straight. So you want kids who attend HBCUs that are mostly in warm climates to come to Milwaukee, where the temperature is sub-zero in the winter, and it's the worst place for African Americans to live. Tell me again how you think you're going to get those young people to come here. So if there's an idea of elevating the city and Milwaukee becoming a region of choice as the Metropolitan Milwaukee Alliance of Commerce, Association of Commerce always talks about, the first thing is, how are you taking care of the residents that are already in your city if you're trying to get other people who don't live here to come here? That's why it's important that every resident is valued, promoted, and protected. Because if they're protected here, then others are going to look at that and say, maybe Milwaukee is a place to go. Milwaukee has had for the last 5 years the largest outward migration percentage in the country. People are leaving in droves. People leave regularly. And there's they call it the brain drain, right? You see young professionals who leave regularly because they don't feel valued. They don't feel like they can be promoted. They don't feel protected. But that also exists for every resident in the city. This should be a moniker we live by every day. But in order for us to feel valued, promoted, and protected, that means we have to address the barriers that do not allow for people to feel that way or to be in positions to feel valued. So the process launched in 2016. It's funny to always see this picture because there's a little skinny guy sitting right there. That was actually a part of this from the beginning. But process launched in 2016, and this was a 12-month process, right? So obviously, when we talk about violence prevention and we talk about violence in the city, people are always looking for ways to speed up the process, right? There is a level of urgency that exists when it comes to violence. I understand that. But if we rush through processes and trying to really create effective and efficient strategies towards prevention, then it'll be less effective and may cause even more damage. So that's why this took a year. But when you look at everyone who was included, you can see why it took a year, right? We had youth focus groups. We had over 1,000 young people in this city participate in this, right? That's huge. Over 1,000 young people participated in Blueprint. We have a survivor forum. We had a youth survey that was done. We had our steering committees where different partners were at the table, all the way from the mayor himself to grassroots. We're sitting at that. I'm not going to say down because everybody's important in this work. All the way to grassroots. Everybody was at the table having these discussions and talking about the ways in which we strategically plan around prevention. We had community stakeholder meetings. We had faith leader briefings, community brainstorming, right? If every value, you cannot have a vision of talking about value and promoted and protected and not include the opinions of people who have not been valued and promoted and protected. That's backwards. So there was a concerted effort to ensure that every voice was heard around prevention. And then ultimately the blueprint was released in 2017 and has been driving the work of the Office of Violence Prevention ever since. So here are the 4 principles when it comes to the blueprint, right? First, starting with community, the guided principles, first starting with community. So it's really to ensure that it was informed by youth and families, right? This was something, again, as I said in the beginning, this was not a bureaucratic approach. Bureaucratic approaches are very much less respected in communities, especially when the work targets them. You can't keep telling people this is what I think is best for you instead of asking them what do they think is best for them. That kind of makes no sense because there's no real sense of ownership and then that elevated responsibility because I feel like I was a part of the process. It was not just someone coming in and creating another program, creating another nonprofit. Because there's a reason why Milwaukee is the nonprofit capital of the world per capita. We have programs and nonprofits that address the same issues, and they are created and continue to be created over and over and over and over again. Instead of how do we figure out a way to combine those efforts and include the community in the work? Right? So that's why this was one of our guiding principles, was to ensure that that connection, that engagement was there around this process. And then from there, we went to the idea of equity, because we understand that there are some neighborhoods where violence has been impacted at a more disproportionate rate than others. Right? So we have to ensure that the representation is there from those neighborhoods or from those areas or from that community to speak to the issues that are happening on a grand level right outside their doors. Makes sense to build that. Because then when you do that, it then talks about the opportunity that leads to the individual and community resilience. So really talking about asset-based solutions, because now that you've had a conversation with the people in those neighborhoods, now we can talk about the assets. What exists in these neighborhoods that is actually positive, that we can increase capacity around, which can overcome potentially the violence that we see. That's one part. The second part is, how do we become more focused on collective efficacy, so then when the community is advocating to their policymakers, there's a conversation of making sure that there's investment in those neighborhoods to also increase capacity. Those are asset-based solutions. But you have people at the table. When you have people at the table from those areas, now it increases the diversity in those perspectives, And then finally, action. Makes no sense to have a meeting and discuss strategy if you don't put action behind it. You had a meeting just to be meeting. We're good at that. We're very good at that. We have a meeting to talk about this meeting and plan for the next meeting to talk about the last meeting we just had. Without the idea of making sure that the action is there and ensuring that there is a way that we can measure exactly what we plan to accomplish. So here's just a model that the blueprint was actually based off of. The Prevention Institute in Oakland, California, who was a collaborating partner on developing the blueprint for peace, created a model called ACER. Now, most people really hear ACEs, which is, adverse childhood experiences. But the ACER model is adverse community experiences and resilience. So there's always a conversation about individual trauma, but there's rarely a conversation until now of a conversation about community trauma, right? So what have been some of the strategies that have been implemented on communities that have elevated the trauma that exists there, right? That's why we have a conversation about racism. That's how we have a conversation about sexism. That's how we have a conversation about phobias, whether that's transphobia, xenophobia, homophobia. What has been some of the practices that have been implemented or that have been imposed on those communities, which have led to the trauma that exists there? Because when you start to talk about a community approach to trauma, that goes back to the vision that says all people are valued, promoted, and protected, right? You're looking at the entire community. It's not just saying we're going to focus individual by individual. How do we elevate the entire community, which then obviously impacts the individual? So there's three principles that we look at in terms of community strategy. So one, equitable opportunities. This model, ACER. Yep. So we look at equitable opportunities, right? So advocacy for adequate living wages, affordable housing, opportunities at home ownership. Black home ownership in this city is extremely low, right? They say that's the great equalizer in terms of wealth building, right? But there have been strategies that existed to ensure that a certain demographic is not getting access to that wealth. And when I usually say that in presentations, people say, well, this is not 1968 or 1969 when we had the Fair Housing Acts. Okay, so then let me ask you this. Why is it that in 2015, Associated Bank had to pay a $200 million lawsuit for discriminatory home lending practices in Wisconsin, in addition to Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota, since all these practices only happened in the 60s? That's 6 years ago. So when you look at the idea around home ownership and the discrimination that happens within it, that has to be considered violence as well. Second principle is around people. So how do people elevate and build stronger social networks, right? A willingness to act for the common good, norms and cultures, establishing norms, building culture within neighborhoods. And then place, right? So safe parks and green space. People want places to just walk with their kids, walk their dogs, enjoy the outdoors. right? But there are a lot of people who are afraid to even come outside. So there has to be a full addressing of trauma that happens within communities. And we have to be real with the issues that have affected those communities in order to really move towards solvency. So here are the goals, 6 goals of the blueprint. First goal, stop the shooting, stop the violence. I think that's pretty clear in where that's going. But that one is actually is what brings up the 414 Life team, right, in addressing violence on the street level. But then this is also an opportunity in terms of advocacy, right? State legislature, some Democrats on the state legislature just reintroduced 2 bills around universal background checks and ERPO laws, which is extreme risk protection orders. Senator Melissa Agard led that effort along with Attorney General Josh Call and others, right? Those are laws we support. But we also talk about ways in which addressing all forms of violence, as well as how do we look at the ways in which people get access to guns. Gun access is too easy, right? That's a conversation that's happening regularly as well. Whether we're talking about ghost guns, 3D guns, people buying conversion kits to switch a semi-automatic handgun to an automatic handgun, access to 60 bullet clips or 100 bullet clips. Like, whose idea was that to even make all that accessible and so easily? So that's 1, stop the shooting, stop the violence. 2, promote healing, restorative justice. This is where RECAST comes in. Again, RECAST was resilient communities after stress and trauma. So talking about the ways in which we're bringing about restorative practices of restorative justice, healing. This work has to be healing centered, right? How do we get towards solvency without first manifesting healing in those communities that have been impacted by violence? It's kind of hard to really move towards strategic planning when you're pissed, or when you're hurt, when you're angry, when you're frustrated. You're still feeling the effects of the traumatic experience, whatever that looks like. That's why it's important that this work is always healing centered. Goal 3, supporting children, youth, and families, right? So ensuring that there's adequate services for young people, youth development and engagement. We always talk about mentorship, but then people say, well, there's nothing to do in the city for young people. There is. There's an entire youth resource guide online right now. It's called Fall Into Fun, youth resource guide that has all types of programs for young people to do. It's under the Beyond the Bell program. So it's not necessarily that there's nothing for them to do. We just need to make sure that we're advertising it better so people can see that there's stuff for youth to do. Okay, goal 4, promoting economic opportunity. We talked a little bit earlier about adequate living wages, right? Giving opportunities for people to move who are interested in entrepreneurship, making sure they have access to capital to do that. We also know there are discriminatory practices in access to capital. So people are not able to get the capital necessary to build their businesses. That has to be viewed as violence. The definition of violence is an intended harm that is imposed on a person, a place, or a group of people. So when you see things that are happening that are harmful, that are intentional, that is violence. And it's not just physical or community focused. There are all forms of violence that are intentional that we need to be addressing. 5, fostering safe neighborhoods, right? Talked earlier about making sure building that civic engagement, an opportunity for collective efficacy within, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. It can be both. That's something that we actually address when you look under the promoting healing and restorative justice and talking about mental health, right? First off, there's a stigma to ensure that discusses people who deal with mental health crises are inherently violent. That's not true. Usually there is a triggering mechanism that causes them to move towards aggression. More oftentimes, they're afraid of engagement than to actually force engagement. Right? So that also has to be a conversation. The ways in which we look or view people who have a mental health crisis. There's the automatic thought that they're violent. And it's not true. Right? So it's understanding the various forms of how mental health impacts certain people or impacts people. And then again, we talked earlier, how are we providing treatment instead of looking at it as a way of punishment? And there are best practices across the country that are doing that, where they're dispatching licensed counselors instead of dispatching police. We have the CART team here, which dispatches both counselors and police, but there are a lot of people who are even nervous to see police come. Right? And then what you're asking police is to be able to address mental health crises with 8 hours of training. And they're being dispatched with practitioners that went through 4+ years of training. Somebody's got to help me understand that. So there are spaces now where we're having discussions around alternative responses to ensure that there is actual assistance, therapists, counselors that are being dispatched to those crises or to those incidences so that they can get the necessary treatment that they need versus there being a ruling of an iron fist. And the way that you do that is you dispatch those who have the experience in addressing mental health. So that's something that we are working on now. Did I answer your question? Mm-hmm. 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 And I guess, I'm not going to say I guess, I think another way that we look at that is it's kind of similar to gun violence. The majority of people who participate in gun violence have been impacted by it in some way, whether it's directly or indirectly, right? We said earlier that hurt people hurt people. So then there's an opportunity, I believe, for there to be a grandiose movement of advocacy to say, we have to hold systems accountable for this. That's why I said we don't talk about violence in systems enough. Because we're looking at the person who committed the act, we're looking at servicing the person who was the victim of the act, but we're not talking enough about the root causes of what led to the whole incident happening in the first place. It's almost like they're left off the hook. Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. 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 Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Thank you, everybody, for that great conversation. I'm hoping people virtually will be able to hear some of that. Um, so then the final point, the final goal is strengthening capacity and coordination of violence prevention efforts, right? So again, this conversation that just happened would be a move towards goal 6. So trying to build around capacity and coordination that supports mental health services. That's a form of violence prevention, right? The same way you try to build capacity and coordination around youth engagement and development, right? Bringing together those who are engaged in youth serving work to strengthen that capacity, to build that coordination, to ensure that we're not just looking at individual entities around youth development and engagement, but there is a full coalition that focuses on youth engagement, right? That has to be the work when we're talking about building capacity. So here are the sectors that we address, right? Well, the only one that we have not addressed at this point that we're trying to do now is transportation, right? That's a very difficult shell to crack. But outside of that, these are all the priority sectors that we have from the Office of Violence Prevention, right? So whether we're talking about public policy, whether we're talking about public health, discussion in after school programming, criminal justice, the juvenile justice system. Do you all know that it's $110,000 per year to incarcerate one juvenile? Could you imagine the investment at the forefront? If we use that same money for investment into youth development at the beginning, $110,000 a year. I'm sure I'll be able to share it. Or I can give you my contact information. I can share it as well. So we posted the app? Okay. But when you think of that, right? $110,000 a year for one juvenile. And what's even more amazing is that we have a coalition. Solana's actually participating in this, our Youth Justice Wisconsin Coalition, right? And they did a statewide survey on youth incarceration. And what did people feel like? What was the best form in terms of servicing young people? 70% of the states said that they preferred alternatives to youth incarceration. 70%. And yet here we are still working on how do we get rid of Copper Lake and Lincoln Hills? Supposed to be, but there's been a delay in that. So there has to be a conversation of if 70% of the state supports alternatives to youth incarceration, what are we doing to push that to make sure those alternatives happen? Right? Those are the priorities that are addressed in the Office of Violence Prevention, but not just us, it's a lot of people. Yes, ma'am. It's not all youth. It's not all youth. No, it's just youth. Do you have the number to that? What's the number in terms of adult incarceration? I can't remember that. I'm sure it's way more than that. Yeah. Yeah, for them to engage more. Yeah. Absolutely. We actually have, United States makes up 4% of the world's population, but we have 22% of the prison population. That's a lot, right? So if you're incarcerating so many people without the alternatives, like she just said, right, all we're doing is creating a revolving door back into incarceration. The idea of penitentiary, the root word of penitentiary is penance, which means through rehabilitation. So there should be a focus on helping people to change from those behaviors that they engaged in so that they don't come back to this place again, right? But we see that our prisons are more focused on punishment than actual rehabilitation. That's an issue. So that's why you see the revolving door. That's why you see the recidivism. That's why you see it. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. So then that begs this question: what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Right. No, that's the thing. That's the thing. Mm-hmm. And thus my question of when we're going to have the conversation about addressing systemic violence. That's exactly why we're saying that. Just by the question that you just asked, when are we going to start investing at the beginning? So that we're not having a dependency on punishment later. That has to be a conversation within. So why? Because I'm sure people who are in these systems also know what you just asked. So then the question becomes, why do you still choose to do it this antiquated way? Because that's more so of violence. Which I think is a good idea. But then the other side is we still haven't addressed the system that caused the problem in the first place. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. That's a conference on its own, right? So, oh, no argument. No. With degrees. Yeah. Right. So I know what, trying to make sure we stay on time, stay on track. I know we got to, because I'm not trying to stand between anybody and lunch. We're not doing that. So here are just some highlights around the ways in which we've had some investment within violence prevention or within the office. We have donated over $4 million, well, provided funding of over $4 million to community-based organizations that focus on mental health, trauma prevention, healing, right? There's a program, this is really has been through our recast program, but the idea also is ensuring that we're providing the funding that are necessary for organizations that are doing the hard work, right? There is a need, as we just saw, to ensure that people have the necessary funding to do the work and that they're actually getting and being compensated for their work. Another aspect is we've also received national funding from Google, Everytown for gun safety, the Annie E. Casey Foundation. This is something that's very important as well, this Build Health Challenge Award. So there is efforts that are happening in the Sherman Park neighborhood, which has seen a rash of violence lately, right? But there are efforts that are happening within the city, within the Sherman Park neighborhood that have brought together 4 partners, the Office of Violence Prevention, Ascension, St. Joseph's, United Way, and the Sherman Park Community Association to figure out, in collaboration with the Build Health Community Coalition, we have a community coalition of 25 residents in the Sherman Park neighborhood to figure out the best ways to create strategic planning around health equity in Sherman Park using Blueprint as the foundational framework, right? The objective then becomes, how do we replicate that in other neighborhoods, right? How do we replicate that in a neighborhood like Metcalf Park, North Division, Old North Milwaukee, Garden Homes, or Southside, Historic Mitchell, Clark Square? How do we invest in those neighborhoods and make sure that there's an opportunity similar to this project that's happening in Sherman Park, right? Those should be efforts that are replicated and invested in. Can't keep asking people to engage in this work and not incentivize it or not compensate. Yes, ma'am. 2020. Well, it started in 2019. The kickoff was in December of 2019. clearly 2020 was impacted by a certain pandemic. But so now it's like a re-engaging again of getting that program back on track. So this is an example of what it looks like in the blueprint. This is goal 4. So advancing economic opportunity. There are, again, 6 goals, but there are 30 strategies total within the 6 goals, and there are 88 action steps. So there's a lot that goes into what strategic planning look like within violence prevention. And I just want to give you all a quick example of what one of the goals and the strategies and action steps look like. So strategy 2 under goal 4 was connect adults to employment opportunity with a living wage and remove accessibility barriers, right? So then here's an action step then under this strategy. So create incentives and improve employer readiness to hire and retain those facing accessibility barriers. A few years ago, we worked in partnership with Alderwoman Malele Cox to create a policy called the Social Responsibility Ordinance. The idea then was to incentivize businesses that were hiring and retaining single mothers, breastfeeding mothers, making sure that they were able to make it convenient for them to feed their children, providing them adequate wages for childcare, because childcare costs are insane, right? So those companies that were being more intentional in serving that population, there was an incentive that was going to be provided for those businesses. Still there. Clearly we need to get more businesses on board, but it's still there. Right? So there is, again, there's a strategy that's in place and there's action that's happening. So that's pretty much that's the build when we talk about the blueprint, right? Making sure not only we're talking about goals, but you have strategies under those goals, and then you have the actual action steps that the community discussed and what was necessary for prevention. So really quick, these are the priority neighborhoods that we looked at first, right? We tracked data from 2014 to 2016, talking about simple assaults, aggravated assaults, non-fatal shootings, homicides, and these were the 10 neighborhoods that had the highest levels of each one of these incidences, and this is how we started to focus our work within these neighborhoods. Right? So again, remember I talked about you have work going on in Sherman Park. How do you replicate, step over here, how do you replicate the same work in North Division, Harambe, Amani, Midtown, Lincoln Village, Historic Mitchell? How are you doing that same work in those neighborhoods, similar to what's happening in Sherman Park? There's a need to make sure that there's that model is being replicated. Right? And the best part of it is that there is a community coalition that's leading the work. Right? We're essentially like TA, like we're technical assistants. We support, but the community leads the work. That's the model that needs to be increased. That's happening. Near like, picture like 27th Street, just north of Capitol. Like, you know where that Eaton building is? Like that surrounding neighborhood. Yep. Mm-hmm. Well, that was at that time. Yeah, but yeah, a lot of people were like, "Dang, Harambe got like that." Yeah, but that's fact to remember. That's like all of those. So it's not just like gun homicides or anything. You also have this. Sure. Huh? I'm hoping so. Yeah. But again, she was saying she was surprised that Metcalf Park wasn't on here. But remember, again, this was at the time from 2014 to 2016. Right? So it wasn't one in the top 10. Those were the top 10. Oh, it was named Metcalf Park. These were just the ones that had the highest level. But when you look at all of these, simple assaults, aggravated assaults, non-fatal shootings, and homicides. Absolutely. And there could be different neighborhoods in there. That is actually, we do have more accurate data than this. This is just what was based out of the blueprint at the time. You know what I'll say to that? One, remembering that this is older data, 2016, but then two, I don't think the news really cares about the neighborhood reporting at all. The certain neighborhood. I just think it's more of an elevation of this is what's happening in urban settings. It's always. But the idea when we talk about violence prevention, it's not just a north side issue, it's a south side issue as well. So there has to be a discussion of how we are not only servicing the north side, but how we service the south side, right? How are we servicing the city? Let's just go there. How are we servicing the city in terms of violence prevention? That has to be the discussion, right? Say again. Absolutely. It is. So here's goal 5, right? So again, recommended, the first strategy within this goal is creating safe and accessible community spaces. So then an action step would be promoting neighborhood revitalization and addressing physical blight, nuisance properties. You know, that would be the idea of fostering safe and stronger neighborhoods, right? One way that you can improve a neighborhood is also is improving the imagery of a neighborhood. So when we talk about blighted properties, nuisance properties, and the likes, like how are we working to then remove nuisance properties or rebuild blighted properties so that there is some form of revitalization that's happening in the neighborhoods, which could restore, you know, pride in neighborhood. That's a strategy as well. There's an effort that's called CPTED. It's an acronym. It's crime prevention through environmental design. Right? So the ways in which we're even designing neighborhoods could increase the likelihood of prevention within neighborhoods. Right? So these are all different strategies that are included within the blueprint, this final one. So I want you all to look at this, and this one is very important because this shows the lexicon that is necessary, the lexicon of partners and supporters and stakeholders that's necessary in order to really prevent violence, right? This has to be a whole health system approach, right? But when we say health system, we're not just talking about hospital institutions, right? We're talking about faith-based institutions. We're talking about schools, social service providers, public health departments, community organizations, community residents, academic medical centers. Everybody is involved in this. That's why I said in the beginning, yeah, we may be the Office of Violence Prevention, but every person in here is a part of violence prevention in some shape, form, or capacity. But that's why it's important that we have an actual conversation of what violence is if we're going to talk about every person as a part of violence prevention. Because if I make that statement and we don't talk about what violence really looks like, people can easily say, well, I'm not the police. I'm not taking the bullet for anybody, right? I'm not asking you to do that because guess what? Neither am I. So there has to be but there are other forms of violence that we can address, that we all can be a part of, especially from the beginning. That has to be a focus, right? There's a 3-tiered approach to prevention. I want you all to remember this, right? The first thing is primary prevention, meaning that we're cutting it off from the beginning. Like we're preventing it from happening in the first place. The second part is secondary prevention, which means that there are interventions that are put in place so that what has happened won't happen again. And then we can still focus on ensuring that there's also prevention strategies as well. And then the third part is what I talked about earlier, and I think this is what's also key, is the healing-centered approach, right? So for those who have been impacted by that violence, ensuring that there are resources necessary for that healing from that trauma so that they can be able to function and live their best selves, right? All of those different strategies, all of those three areas are necessary in terms of prevention. But this is vital because every last one of these institutions, every last stakeholder, every last resident, everybody is important when we talk about preventing violence. It can't just be one office. It has to be all of us. So here's my contact information. If anybody wants to get in contact with me, my email is here, my phone number is here. Any questions that you all may have, if you all want hard copies of the blueprint, I'll be able to provide that for you as well. But if you want to look at the blueprint online, that is the website, www.414life.com. You can check out the website online. Any questions about the blueprint that you may have, I would be the person that you would connect with to have those conversations. Were there any other questions, comments? I'm trying to, y'all got 6 minutes now before lunch, so. Mm-hmm. I think first off, it's the idea of figuring out exactly what healing does look like for every person. Having a discussion and building those relationships, because then now we can talk about exactly what healing means to you, right? We can't have a generalized focus of healing, right? There are ways in which everybody, to your point, there are ways in which everybody chooses to be healed. So there's various practices that are in place and that can fit under the monicum of what people are requesting in terms of addressing that healing. That's one. Hire and retained. Yeah. Oh yeah. But that's been a conversation for a long time. There's always been a bunch of strategies in terms of having a non-biased approach to hiring. That I don't think it was a part of that discussion, but there have been others in terms of the ways in which you try and ensure that people have a fair shot without any bias. That's one of them. Yeah. That's always a $1 million question. We're trying to create as many volunteer opportunities as possible. One thing is, again, stay in contact with me. Anything that we have, we also want to create an email list. That's something that I've been really trying to focus on. That's hard as heck, but just being able to keep people informed of exactly what we're doing. Mm-hmm. One thing also that would be good is for me to come, because we do neighborhood level presentations on the blueprint as well. So mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That has a lot to do with it. that could have a lot to do with it. So that could be another idea, is any neighborhood level presentations that people are interested in, because those could be used as a means to start strategic planning within their own neighborhoods, right? Just using the blueprint as the foundational work. So there's an opportunity there as well. Absolutely.